Steve, we're our first chat for the podcast was backstage at the San Francisco Symphony, and it was like long overdue because I think it was 20 years ago or 21 years ago. I don't even know if you remember this, but you were my bass coach at the Pacific Music Festival. I think it was 21 years ago in Sapporo, Pacific Music Festival. That was a blast. And then we chatted, I don't even remember when that was, 2018, 2019, about your first album and a few things.
Yeah, what's the date on this thing? I can't remember. Yeah, anyway.
So welcome to the podcast studio.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, well, I remember Pacific Music Festival. What a rewarding place. I mean, I got to do a recital there, and I met all you wonderful interns or whatever you call it. Yeah. And had a great time listening to the orchestra concerts, and then actually playing with you guys, and then giving individual coachings. You know, it was really.
I remember you working with me on Solo Bach, actually.
Yeah.
It's great. I can't believe it's 21 years ago at this point. A few things have happened. Among them, your first album, which has, I'll link up to all this stuff, but you got this great photo of you at the Golden Gate Bridge. So the rep is great, and the photo is great, and it's a really cool kind of project you're on, this annual album project, right? Am I describing that right?
Yeah, well, I've always been a recitalist, even before I got in the San Francisco Symphony, even before I became, a faculty member of many educational institutions. But, and I enjoyed playing recitals, and they're really terrific for developing your musicianship and challenging you. They require all this, blood and sweat and heart and soul. But, you play this concert and hopefully you feel good afterwards and you have reached your audience and affected them in some way. But then it's gone, right? So back a few years, I realized, I'd like to sort of make as part of my legacy being my kids and my students, and make a legacy of sharing my music that I connect with and my musicianship, So I decided to look at some of those repertoire pieces that I did in previous recitals. But I also decided that I would curate and create eclectic programs for recording. And I chose a kind of a three-pronged approach. One being sort of either lesser known or even undiscovered, bass repertoire. And then the second would be maybe looking at repertoire of other instruments, string instruments, and even wind instruments, and exploring how they could be transcribed for to be played on the bass. And then the third was to commission composers to write music for me to be played in concert and in recording. So my first CD was an eclectic mix of all three of those. And so I decided that the first one went very, very well. I had a great situation at the Conservatory of Music where I am on faculty. I'm able to record in the space of the recital hall with wonderful equipment and a fantastic recording engineer. And that that first CD went very well, that one called Walkabout. So then I proceeded to create another program for a second CD, and a piece that I thought was sort of neglected, or not neglected, but not so well recorded was Spiegel and Spiegel, which means mirror in the mirror. So what you have are these recurring tonic triads and fragmentary melodies that go up and down, and one after the other, but they always settle on the common note A in the key of F. And so I thought that if I could make really beautiful fragmentary melodies going up and down, but then always settle on that A, I'll use this A harmonic and really give the person a feeling of center of home, So that was the piece that I wanted to do from the known bass repertoire. But then I was reading actually the early diaries of Sergei Prokofiev, and letters and writings when he was a student at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And I recall that he spoke about being bugged by a colleague in school, a cellist, to have him write a piece for him and this cellist to perform. And so one summer, in the middle of their studies, he wrote this piece called Balad. And I was very intrigued by that and asked many cellists about this piece. And it's amazing. A lot of cellists don't know anything about this piece. So I checked it all out and thought it was an incredibly dramatic and challenging piece, especially for the piano, because Prokofiev would have played it himself, right? So I transcribed that piece. Another transcription was a piece by Edmund Rubra, who's a British composer, mid-20th century composer. I was driving in the car one day and I heard like this very intriguing symphonic piece, and I waited till the end for the announcement, and it was by Edmund Rubra, and it was a symphony, and he was a symphonist and wrote a lot of choral music. But I checked out his chamber music, and I saw that he wrote this duo for English horn and piano that was commissioned by this Dutch oboist, Peter Brie. And so I knew that the English horn register was a really good one to transcribe for a solo bass. So that's another piece that I'm playing. It's very, very, very evocative and long-lined, single movement piece that's on this particular CD. And then I was speaking with my first bass teacher, Bob Olson, who was a member of the Boston Symphony for many, many years, and he's now retired. And he was a composer himself. In fact, he was a double major in school as a composer and a bass player. And we were talking about music that he was interested in, that he liked. And he showed me this piece by Hindemith that Hindemith himself transcribed. It was called Meditation. And it is a movement from a ballet called Noblissima Visione, which is 11-movement ballet about the life of St. Francis. And this one movement called Meditation is kind of a spiritual meditation that St. Francis has. And so Hindemith transcribed it for violin and piano, and then later for viola and piano, of course, and then cello and piano. And so Bob Olson said, I think it would sound really fantastic on bass. So he inspired me to transcribe that piece for bass and piano. And on my first CD, a piece by Jeffrey Keyser, the eminent, renowned jazz pianist, composer, right? And he wrote this really wonderful, engaging piece called Renovations. And when I was making the second CD, I asked him if he had anything else that he might lay on me, and he said that he actually made a wonderful transcription for cello and piano of a Hawaiian tune called Pua'ahihi, and he based it on a slack key guitar version that Keola Beamer, the Hawaiian artist, did of this tune. It's a tune that sort of compares love with the particular flower blossoms of the ahihi plant. And so he sent it to me, and I fell in love with it, and I had to record it. It's a beautiful melody, but in the middle it has this nice kind of instrumental interplay with the piano. And I have this very close friend, Chris Paler, who is a bass player, but a renowned jazz composer, and writes music for TV and movies, and and for LP recordings, and he saw a recital of mine, and he said, Steve, I got to arrange something for you. So he took two very, very, very famous melodies, Shenandoah and Londonderry Air, which is also known as Danny Boy, and just created these beautiful, lush, jazz-inspired accompanimental harmonies underneath. So, but in the category of commissions, I decided to ask my dear friend Lawrence Wolf, who I also studied with at the New England Conservatory of Music, who has become quite a composer in his own right, writing music for orchestra and chorus and chamber music. And I said, Larry, just write me something for bass, a beautiful melody with piano. And so he came up with Melodies, which turned out to be a very incredibly haunting piece that has a real story to tell. Very, very moving piece. So I'm very pleased that I could bring that music to life.
He's such an inspiring guy, Larry Wolf. I think that's one of the few LPs I own. I was kind of in that generation right after that. Is that fantastic with the Glier
pieces and the Kozovitsky pieces?
Yeah. It's such a great album. My teacher Michael Hovnanian was really, who studied with Larry Wolf briefly as well, was really into that album. Had you been composing before you studied with Larry, or was he like? Did he kind of like that spark in you and arranging? Because I mean, it's so cool. I love what you're doing. By the way, I'll ask a very. I'll get to the questions, but it's so cool to kind of be this catalyst for bringing music out into the world for the bass. I think it's really exciting, and what a cool project. Well, I probably brought this up on our last podcast, but I know a lot of stand-up comedians who commit to doing an hour of new material every year, or every couple of years or something. And that's such a cool thing to commit to, is like bring an album's worth of material into the world. And you've had so much in your life that has come across your plate. I mean, you'll never run out of material, I'm sure. So I guess my question, very roundabout way, is did Larry like that spark in you?
Absolutely. I mean, he, I can remember doing bass quartet arrangements that he did of really funny tunes and very challenging, in fact. And then he would also share music that he wrote for himself, and very difficult stuff. And so he was always involved in arranging, and he would, in lessons, he would even sort of improvise with you while you were playing your piece. He's a force, a musical force, very creative.
He was one of my very first podcast guests. He reached out to me. He said, "You're doing this thing." This is back in 2007, when people would say what's a podcast? Who are you? What's a podcast? And why should I be on it? But he was one of and just such a fascinating, inspiring person. So he kind of lit that spark. That's really cool. I love what you're doing here. It fascinates me. I brought up Michael Hovnanian. That an observation Michael Hovnanian, who just retired from the Chicago Symphony, that he said to me is that, people, once they get into a professional orchestra, you've got one of the best positions in the country, it's safe to say, people kind of go in two directions. One, and there are probably more levels to this, but people kind of stay in their lane and kind of do their job, and maybe they punch the clock in and out. And then people that stay engaged in music, they usually have something outside of the job that's kind of lighting that, keeping them going. And so, and you do a lot. You teach and you compose and obviously arrange, and now you're doing this. But I think it's fascinating, people who are in a major orchestra and have been for many years. It's just interesting to see what gets them going creatively.
Yeah, I feel like I get stimulation from many arenas. When I'm teaching, I get so many great ideas from students. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'd like to do this piece, or I'd like to do that piece, or what do you think of? I even learn about fingerings from students, and I've always felt like when I was growing up, I always felt like I had music in me, and I wanted to compose, and I even took composition lessons at Eastman, and then later on at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music with John Adams, of all people, who was very encouraging. And I, in fact, wrote a piece. Every time I would see him, because he was composer in residence at the San Francisco Symphony for many years, and every time I would see him, and we'd be premiering some new piece of his, and he'd say, "Steve, so what have you written lately?" That kind of thing. And so I wrote a piece called Choir Boxes for 10 cellos and 8 basses, and I showed it to him. He said, "Oh man, what a great piece! Wish I had seen this piece, sooner, so that I could write, for the bass better," and that kind of thing. So he was very encouraging in that regard. But I just think if you're involved in music, and here I am in an orchestra, I hear great musicians around me in the orchestra, but I hear great soloists, and you just get, excited about what they're doing. And so you want to explore and say, hey, what's out there? What can I play?
We were talking about that piece backstage, weren't we? That cello bass piece. I think we're having a conversation about having some sort of creative restriction. I think, like putting a rule in place, like I can't do this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but was that the piece where you were only going to use the white keys of the piano?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Quincy Jones was.
It was the Quincy Jones documentary that we were talking.
Yeah, where he said, like if you set limitations for yourself, you actually become more creative.
Yeah.
Right? So because you have less to work with on your palette, right? So
I got to think it changes the way you approach just making music in general, composing and performing. I barely compose anything. I've arranged some things, but once I got into the groove of arranging, this is a few years ago, it really started to change the way I thought just about the other pieces I was playing, because I was kind of looking at it from the composer's mind, maybe. I'm sure you've had that experience, kind of living in both worlds.
Yeah, I think, you make really good choices, better choices about what keys to write it in, what registers to use, what works, what doesn't work.
And you got to learn a lot about your own bass playing. Like I've never recorded an album. I don't know if I ever will, but even just like doing YouTube videos and listening back to myself, I learn a lot about my playing. I can only imagine that, putting your playing under a microscope for an album kind of you feel the same thing.
So it used to be that I'd listen to myself and I go, I could have done this here and I could have done that there. But now I'm at the point I really like what I did there. So not to say that I'm egotistic or anything like that, but I feel like at a point in my life where I'm much more of a mature artist, and in fact feel like I play better than I have ever played, and that there's no limit to what you can do. Just keep that, concept in your head and, work towards it, and then you'll realize it.
It's one of the cool things about music is you can keep developing and getting better. It's a little bit different than if you're like an MMA fighter or something like that. I know my limited recording experience, I've gotten a lot, I kind of approach projects differently, knowing I know what needs to happen to get the finished product. Like you had the first album and then you have this album. Did you approach the preparation process differently, having gone through it once with the first album?
Well, okay. So the way I worked on the second album was I wasn't playing stuff that I had played before. Like for the first album, I actually, had played most of that in recital or several recitals prior to going into the studio and recording it. This particular one, I decided I was going to tackle each piece individually. And I worked out my schedule with Keisuke Nakagoshi, my fantastic musical partner, on the piano, and we concentrated on one piece at a time, and then scheduled the recording and got it done, and so on with the rest.
So interesting how just the whole process, because you have this finished product here, but there's always a story behind capturing it. And I did a recording project down in Nashville a couple months ago, and now it's online, but like there's the whole story behind going through it. And I was talking to a bassist named Gaylord DeWald a few years ago. He's like a contemporary bassist, and he recorded this album in rural Colorado inside of like an old water tank. It's the craziest acoustic you'll ever hear, and like a 30-second reverb. And so it's just really interesting to. Like,
so that water tank becomes like an extension of his instrument,
it was
right?
part of the instrument.
He has to learn how to live there and play there. And
people used to break into this tower and record and have like these sort of like hippie, spontaneous concerts. And then it became a little bit more formal. I think it's called thetank.org or something like that. But it's just so interesting how, like you have this thing and it's like out in the world, but there's just all that goes into it, from the finding the music and the selection process. And I think it's so cool that you're doing this and you've got that sort of, you're like a musical detective in a way, finding these pieces that are going to work for the bass.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are pieces that I didn't play on this CD, that I eliminated. But I'm very, very, very proud of everything that I've done here, and spending enough time to really work on it and play it for people. And because I think that you can't just learn something and then play it in recording. You have to actually air it out and get feedback and all that.
I looked at the album and I said, oh yeah, I wonder if this is coinciding with COVID, because I thought you looked a little worried in the photo. Actually, looking back, you don't look worried at all. But
I look pretty relaxed. Yeah, right. Yeah, I got it done. Right. Yeah. In fact, that was a really great photo done by a former student of mine, Matt Washburn. Who's become quite a photographer now. So.
Well, and that's another part of the story too, is like, what are you going to put on the cover? Like, I love that Golden Gate Bridge on the first album. That's an epic photo. And I was talking, your colleague Charles Chandler, he and Amos Yang, your another colleague, try to find a cover photo for their album that they put out. It's like really tricky actually to figure out what goes with these selection of pieces. It's just interesting, like how the sausage gets made with something like this.
Right. Yeah. And then once you've got the picture, like, are you thinking about like title, and for me, home base just made sense, considering, how in the past 18, 20 months, we've all been at home, and so I wanted to share my music making in a comforting, warm environment with, everybody.
Anything else you want to get out about this one? I'll obviously send people to Apple Music, Spotify.
Yeah, all the music services, it's there. You can find it. You can also, find links on Tramontozzimusic.com.
Beautiful. I'll send them there too.